Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
And this is Gender, a Wider Lens, a podcast dedicated to the shifting concepts around gender in our contemporary culture.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we seek to open up the discourse around this hot-button issue.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens.
Hi, Stella.
How's it going, Sasha? How's life?
Life is great. I am so glad we finally got to talk to Dr. Joshua Coleman today.
Yeah, it was really, really, really good. Really, I think a really helpful discussion for anybody who's a parent. It's not just parents of estranged parents who are estranged. It's kind of a discussion about how hard it is to be a parent, but also how there's a culture of really, really harshness towards parents that Joshua has completely taken up on.
Yeah, so he's an estrangement expert. And as we talk about today, he is a psychologist who started realizing when he became estranged from his adult daughter that there wasn't really a lot of resources out there that were helpful. It was more like therapists suggesting that parents, get really aggressive about it and defend themselves. And actually, Joshua's strategy is parents need to find ways to kind of own up to errors that they have made, mistakes they have made. And he talks about how the cultural shift in what is expected of parents has been so massive. And so now a lot of young people feel like if they are upset about anything their parents have done, that they should go no contact, quote unquote, or cut them off. And sometimes by the encouragement of a therapist or a peer group or a spouse. So we got into so much. And there was, of course, lots and lots of overlap with parents of gender questioning young adults who may make particular demands of them and then cut them off. And so it was a very rich conversation.
There's an entire culture or campaign almost built around cut off your parents among gender questioning adults, that they're really getting it in the neck. And it's very queer theory. It dismantles the family, blames the parents. It's a horrible attack on parents and families that's kind of happened. And I really think that more and more I feel parents are just bewildered because they've been loving, and he talks about that, they've been loving and engaged. And of course they're not blameless. They're as human as any of us, you know what I mean? But the determination to blame the parent for the adult child's unhappiness is a new phenomenon. And he when he first got into it, it wasn't we weren't in this world. I see it. I go on Mumsnet, and if you see a parent comes in and they say something, and or a woman comes in and immediately people say block them, ghost them, no contact, block them. This is so often the advice these days. I'd go no contact, go no contact. This is why you need to go no contact. That wasn't in our lexicon 10 years. Nobody was even saying those words, block them and no contact and all this. So I think it's part, as Joshua said, it's part of the individualistic culture, but it leaves us all very solo and very, very vulnerable because we don't have our tribe.
Yeah. And it was interesting to talk about how, the current individualistic culture is all about personal development and growth and kind of being in your bliss. And like, if anything in your world is not contributing to your bliss or whatever, then it is not worth your time. And so it is this very conflict avoidant personality trait that is almost being embodied in the culture. Wow. And that's really interesting when you think about this cutting off your parents. It is an avoidance. And Joshua says something like it's done in this sense of being this really strong thing, assertive thing that you do for your self-care, but it's actually just conflict avoidance. And that was really a moment.
Such a good point. It's a culture of conflict avoidance. It's an actual culture of it. But when you think about it with your parents and your family, your siblings, there's something about your family that will be there for you in a way, even though they annoy you, that will be there for you when you need them, in a way that we don't ask of our friends. We don't even ask of our partners as much sometimes as our family. It's like the hospital needs somebody to collect me, so you have to collect me at 8 o'clock on Tuesday, okay? That's the way we speak to our family.
Yeah.
While if it's our friend, it would be, could you possibly do me this? I don't want to put yourself out, but if you could, maybe. Or we wouldn't even ask them. We ask a good deal more from our family. And then when we cut them, I think, there's been thousands of years, we've always grown up around the family and the bonds of the family. And of course, there's exceptions, but ultimately, most people have their family somewhere in their life. And to cut them is to do something very radical and very brutal. And it shouldn't be done lightly. And it feels like it's being done lightly. And I think everybody suffers as a result.
Yeah. I mean, we touch on cases where it may be appropriate. Obviously, there are buckets within this group of kids who, like, they're genuinely maybe trying to respond to a very abusive parent, right? So there is always room for nuance here, but it definitely feels like the cultural trend is towards very quickly cutting anyone out of your life, including your own flesh and blood parents, if they make you feel upset. Even if that upset is about some personal kind of guilt you're struggling with or some other thing going on, they're a reflection of that, right? So it was a fascinating conversation. And maybe before we jump in, I'll read Dr. Coleman's bio and we'll let listeners have at it. So Dr. Coleman is a psychologist in private practice in San Francisco and a senior fellow with the Council on Contemporary Families. He writes the Dear Doctor column for Maria Shriver's Sunday paper and has written for the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, NBC Think, The Behavioral Scientist, and many other publications. He is a frequent guest on The Today Show and NPR, and he's also been featured on Sesame Street, 2020, Good Morning America, PBS, America Online Coaches, and numerous news programs like Fox, ABC, CNN, and NBC. He's also the co-editor, along with historian Stephanie Kuntz, of 7 online volumes of The Unconventional Wisdom, News You Can Use, which is a compendium of noteworthy research on the contemporary family, gender, sexuality, poverty, and work family issues. And he is the author of numerous peer-reviewed articles and chapters and has written 4 books, which we'll include in our notes. And his most recent book is called The Rules of Estrangement.
Yeah, I didn't know about the Sesame Street. That jumps out at me. So well done, Sasha. I'm suddenly honored. Very exciting.
We didn't get to talk about Sesame Street, but we did talk about a lot of other things. So here you go. Before we dive into the conversation, we want to take a quick moment and thank our sponsors, GenSpect and Therapy First. GenSpect is an international organization committed to fostering a healthy approach to sex and gender. GenSpect will be hosting the Bigger Picture Conference in Lisbon, Portugal this September. To learn more about who will be speaking at the conference and to order your tickets, visit genspect.org.
Therapy First is a non-profit worldwide professional association of mental health providers who view psychotherapy as the appropriate first-line treatment for gender dysphoria. Therapy First supports psychotherapists working with gender dysphoric youth and young adults and offers public education on mental health and psychotherapy. Visit therapyfirst.org to learn more.
Now here's the conversation. Hi, Stella, and welcome Joshua to the show.
Thank you for having me.
We're so glad to get you on. We've been referring to your work and talking about your work for a long time because, as you may know, a lot of people with a gender questioning young adult child face issues of estrangement. And so I imagine you've come across this in your work.
Absolutely.
Tell us maybe, how did you become this estrangement expert? Because your work is really like the main thing that people point to when they're trying to understand how to connect with their adult child. So how did you get into this particular work in the first place?
Well, it was, sadly through a personal experience. I have an adult daughter who I'm very close to now, but there was a period of time in her early 20s where she cut off contact with me for several years, in large part due to my becoming remarried and having children in my second marriage, which is fortunately my current marriage, and her feeling in some ways displaced or not as valued. And when she tried to talk with me about it in her early 20s, I was, I think, like so many parents, defensive and not as empathic as I should have been and needed to have been, which kind of alienated her further. So, so she was out of contact with me largely for several years, which was incredibly painful and difficult and disorienting and heartbreaking. And it really wasn't until I kind of learned to just, shut up and be empathic and take responsibility and stop defending and explaining that she began to come back to me, and we eventually reconciled. And so I thought, well, there was really nothing written at the time. And the therapy that I was in at the time gave terrible advice, as so many therapists do for people who are going through this.
Spill.
Well, things like, oh, she'll be back. It's just a matter of time. You don't know that, first of all. Or, well, you need to remind her of all the good things that you've done for her. Nah, that doesn't work. Well, you need to explain the reasons that you made the decisions that you made or the choices that you made. I mean, it's all things that just make the child feel less understood and more like the parents making it about them and being defensive. And defensiveness is really the worst thing that a parent can do when their child has a complaint about them. They don't have to agree with the child's characterization, but being defensive doesn't really carry the day. In fact, it alienates the child even further. So as a result of my experience, I wrote my first book in 2007, When Parents Hurt, Compassionate Strategies When You and Your Grown Child Don't Get Along. As a result of that, I got a wide following in the US and in other Anglophone countries. And as a result of that, started doing a free Q&A every Monday because I had so many questions. I'm sure the same way you guys get, you're probably just flooded with questions. So I started doing a free Q&A to handle the questions. Then I developed a webinar series, which I've been doing for the past 13 years every Tuesday. And as a result of all those experiences, I wrote my more recent book, Rules of Estrangement, Why Adult Children Cut Ties and How to Heal the Conflict, which just expanded my parent influence even greater. Did a large study of 1,600 estranged parents that I published in numerous academic articles. So it's really, at this point, it's the only thing that I do.
Wow.
And I mostly just do consultations with parents who are estranged and reconciliation therapy. So it's become my whole life and my mission.
I'm really struck by how similar it is to gender. People like us, myself and Sasha, working in gender, that it starts off as something that you feel you're filling a gap, and suddenly you realize this is massive, and it's almost unfillable. There are so many parents seeking it, so you have to kind of think of creative ways, because seeing them one by one in a way kind of doesn't cut it, because there's so many of them with similar questions often.
Right. And they all feel so ashamed and defective because they feel like they're the only one. So, when I do my free webinars, I'll have 600 to 700 parents on there. And so many will say, God, it just helps me. It's therapeutic just to see how the fact that I'm not alone, because everybody feels so alone with this. And similarly with parents who are having issues around gender or conflicts about it with the parents. So it's a very similar dynamic.
It reminds me so much of things Stella and I have heard when we've done in-person parenting events. Some parents have said, before I came here, I didn't know what kind of parent would even come to this. Would they be like these weird people that were terrible parents? But then actually we go around the room, we get to know each other. These are loving, intelligent, attentive, really good parents who did all the right things.
Exactly.
And of course, like you say in your work as well, every parent makes some mistakes.
For sure.
Children will feel misunderstood.
Right.
But to be validated that actually I'm not a horrible parent, and that's why this happened to me. I'm actually quite a pretty normal, average, good parent.
Exactly. No, and I think that's part of the reason in my community of estranged parents, people don't talk about it, because they assume that somebody's going to say, well, must have done something pretty terrible to have your kid cut off contact with you. I mean, people don't do it, without a reason. And this is one of the things, I don't know if you experience this in the media or not, but, I'm always getting interviews with journalists. It's kind of like, well, at what point is it okay to cut off a parent? And so many people who write about their own estrangements are people who have had either terrible things happen or believe that they've had terrible things happen. And very little is really written about the parent's perspective and how heartbreaking it is for the parent, how disorienting it is, and particularly for parents who actually did, as you say, a very reasonable, credible job in loving, we're loving parents, and now are being treated like these terrible, awful people. So we're at a funny moment in terms of what the three of us are seeing, right?
Could I take you up on that point? We are at a funny moment because when you first got into it, did you say 2006, 2007?
2007, my first book.
Yeah, it feels like a different time because back then the phrase going no contact, it wasn't up there. Blocking people, it wasn't a concept.
Nope.
And this has come in like a rocket, no more than gender. This concept of just go no contact, ghost them, block them.
Right.
It's become a reflexive response that I can't help think that the cohort of people who would have estranged, it was a much higher bar in 2007. It's almost unrecognizable. Sometimes I hear people talking and I'm like, wow, they cut so fast. Friends, boyfriends, parents, siblings, so fast. They go, it feels like it's a new thing and it feels to me like a really unhealthy thing. So I'm sure you've seen this arc.
Well, I completely agree with you. And it's all tied to this sort of relatively recent quest for identity. I wrote an article a few years ago in the Atlantic called "A Shift in American Values is Fueling Family Estrangements." And one of the things I talk about is that people will say, well, haven't there always been estrangements? And the answer is yes, of course there have been, but never have they been so tied to sort of the notions of protecting my mental health or my growth or my identity. And today, nothing compels an adult child to be in contact with a parent beyond that adult child's desire to be in contact with the parent. And so the kind of psychological preparedness and communication skills and awareness that parents are required of today is really unheard of in any prior generation, of parents. I mean, the idea that parents, a big part of my work is helping parents to write a letter of amends to the adult child where they find the kernel, if not the bushel of truth in the child's complaints and try to see it from the child's perspective. I mean, I don't know about you, but my parents weren't writing me any letters of amends for the ways that they made mistakes. They were like, you're the kid, we were the parents. It was very, very clear. I mean, there's good news, bad news there, right? But it just highlights how much pressure today's parents are under to they have to walk a very thin line to maintain a close relationship with their adult child, particularly once that adult child views the parent as having failed them. And there's just so many other ways to have failed the child at this point.
Yeah. When I started kind of understanding this world and got deeper and deeper into it, sometimes it felt as though the parents were in an abusive relationship or almost like a hostage negotiation kind of thing.
Right.
And something that I've kind of come to understand over the years, and I wonder if you will relate to this, Stella, I think we've talked about this, but initially when I was talking with parents about what to do, it was really focused on like how to get the reconnection, right? Which means, and you can flesh this out for us, Joshua, but like lowering the defensiveness, finding areas of agreement, owning up to anything that you can actually genuinely say you didn't do the best with, and trying to understand your child's perspective, even if you think it's very warped, right? And I've come to realize that there's kind of another thing that's for the goal of reconciliation, but what about the goal of the parental sanity? And so I've now kind of come to understand that there are some parents who feel so hurt and so betrayed by the child's accusations that it's actually not even maybe healthy for them to try and reconcile. Maybe they just need distance and to take care of their own life or whatever. So it's kind of like these two different things. And I wonder, do you work with parents on like readiness? Like, are you ready to reconcile? Because it's a whole different emotional state. I've heard you talk about how this is inherently unfair. So get over that. Like, you can't play the victim and reconcile at the same time.
You're hardcore,
So
Joshua.
there's just so much there that resonates for me in my work. I was just like amazed how much overlap there is.
There is. Yeah. Well, that was probably what drew me to your work, Sasha. So it feels like I'm more familiar with your YouTube videos. I feel like our orientations are remarkably similar, but no, for some parents, they're like, no, screw that. I'm not going to I know that I did a good job. I'm not there's only so many, barriers I'm willing to jump over to reconcile with my child. It's just, at some point, it doesn't feel worth it to me. And I think it's often for those parents whose kid really isn't really ready to reconcile. I think for those parents who have an adult child who are really, really ready to reconcile, and not all of them are. I mean, one of the things that I that I'm at pains to emphasize to parents is you can do everything right in terms of take every single piece of advice I have. I can write you an amends letter. I can reach out to your adult child. Your kids still may not open the door. They may be too negatively influenced by their therapist who assumes every psychological problem in adulthood comes from a childhood trauma, which we know isn't true, but they may have a therapist like that. They may be too influenced by the person that they're married to. Their own mental illness may make them not ready, but they may know no other way to feel separate from you than to be estranged from you. They may feel like you're not really ready to do the work to respect their boundaries or accept them for who they are. So a lot of it is contingent on where the adult child is in terms of their real readiness to reconcile. So I think for those parents who feel like, gosh, I've done everything, I'm not going to just keep doing, a whole nother version of everything. So, but for other parents, for a variety of reasons, they can't go there. Sometimes it's because of their own childhood traumas that it's just too painful to face the ways that they've failed their child, or they can't do that kind of gray area, between the child's reality and their reality, sort of the separate realities, nature of family life, that you can reasonably be considered a good parent and your kid could reasonably feel like you failed them in some way. Not every parent can do that. That alone requires a certain amount of psychological health. So, but no, I have parents that I've said, yeah, if you don't feel like you can do it, you're not morally obligated to do it. I mean, I think both generations have a moral obligation to the other. I do think parents have the moral obligation to some period of time, try to see it from the child's perspective, reach out to them, show empathy, take responsibility, find the kernel, if not the kernel of truth. But they're not obligated to do it forever. And they're not obligated to stay in the ring, if they're being continually abused. Similarly, with the adult child, I think that they have a moral obligation to show empathy for the parent, to assume that the parent did do the best that they could, even if that best was hurtful to them. If the parent is willing to do therapy with the parent, to see the parent as raising them during an era that may have been very different than the contemporary era where the parenting standards have changed. So I think both have a moral obligation to the other. It's just neither side is obligated to do it forever. So anyway.
And it's very important that parents don't arguably support or enable or collude in abusive behavior. And very, very often when mental health is at play, especially if the adult child is really deep in the trenches of mental health, there can be a demand for collusion in the self-destructive behavior. And that, I think, just opens up everything, because it's like, am I going to be estranged from you, which is devastating, or am I going to collude with, frankly, really destructive behavior? Because these seem to be the only two options I'm seeing right now.
For some, yeah, or for some adult children. I mean, here's what's tricky for parents is that, I don't know if you've read Nick Haslam's paper about concept creep, but he's an Australian psychologist who, 2016, developed this notion of concept creep. And he showed that in the DSM that since its inception, there's been this enormous expansion of what we consider to be what we label as psychiatric illnesses. And so what often happens between parents and adult children is that the parents have a much different definition of what constitutes abuseful, harmful, traumatizing, neglectful behavior than do the younger generations, who with their therapists and the Instagram influencers and TikTok influencers, are labeling a lot of behaviors as narcissistic, abusive, gaslighting, boundary crossing, et cetera, that weren't true for the older generations. And so often there's this huge disparity over what's being labeled as abusive. So what I often counsel parents, particularly if parents are being accused of emotional abuse, is for the parent to say something like, it's clear that I have blind spots that I wasn't aware that felt emotionally abusive to you, but I'm glad that you let me know. It's something that I'm happy to work on, either in my own therapy or in family therapy with you, if you let me know the next time that it happens. And that can be kind of a bridging comment between the two perspectives, where you're not going, no, I didn't emotionally abuse you. I'll show you what an emotionally abusive parent looks like. That's what I had. Not I didn't, but that's what so many parents want to say. So.
Yeah, you say somewhere, I watched a video where you talk about like the top 5 mistakes, and you say, don't fight fire with fire.
Right. Oh, yeah.
And this kind of touches on that a little bit. Not to come out guns blazing, because of course parents feel very defensive, understandably.
Understandably.
And yet it's so important. Like something that comes up, I think, in my work is, especially with younger kids, but particularly kids who are, let's say, young adults, but they're under the influence of a really strong belief system or a particular group
Yep.
or a partner or something. Parents have to understand they're dealing with their child who's not at their best, like they're somewhat impaired. So you can't actually go in expecting this egalitarian relationship where it's like you could talk about your feelings and their feelings. Like you're actually dealing with a totally new rules of estrangement, rules of engagement.
Yep.
It's very strange. It's like a kind of negotiation where you're strategic, you're not being authentic. And I think, Stella, you've talked about this. Parents want to feel authentic when they're talking to their child.
Yep.
So it's probably just so exhausting to engage in this bizarre way.
Yeah.
Can you touch on that? Or
Oh, no, I have lots of thoughts about that. Yeah. I mean, when I do reconciliation therapy with the parent and the adult child, one of the things I say to the parent ahead of time is, this is not marriage therapy. You're not going to come in and you cannot expect to have your voice heard in the same way. You can't talk about how hurt and misunderstood and betrayed and angry you feel. This is really like you're in a marriage and your spouse has left you and they're willing to give you another chance. So it's going to be on their terms. So, I'm going to hold you to task. If I see you saying or doing things that's making your child feel defensive, I'm going to let you know in my kind and gentle way. But I will let you know. And I often do hold parents' feet to the fire. But it's very much what you're saying, Sasha, that this is a new, particularly in the spirit of estrangement. I think parents in general who have adult children have to be much more psychological and aware. But a kid who's estranged, it's very much on their terms. Now, why is that? Well, it's because for the adult child, there's enormous upside for them. And if you look at the forums of estranged adult children, you see people saying like, oh, best thing I ever did. Don't need the drama. I had to protect my mental health, never felt better. If you look at the forums for the parents or in your practice, they're like heartbroken, devastated, ashamed. There's no upside to it. And also for the adult child, there's enormous social support for being estranged. There's therapists, there's Instagram influencers, there's forums. It's tied to our American highly individualistic notions of identity and separation and individuation. So for the adult child, there's incredible upside. For the parent, there's absolutely no upside. There's just none. So that also, affects the disparity of who has to do what.
Some of the parents would say that there is an upside in being estranged because of the utter hell and torment they were in.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's a very sad upside.
It's a sad upside, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, or if they have a kid who's so mentally ill that every time they come over, they just steal from the parent or they abuse them or they scream at them. For those parents, it's a relief. I think to your point, Stella, I don't know if they'd say it's an upside, but for some, it is easier than not being estranged and just being constantly abused and mistreated. So, yeah.
I think there's almost a new generation who are part of the generation you touched on, as in they have been arguably perhaps the new cohort that are kind of, I would say maybe some of them are definitely unfairly estranged from children who've been almost brought up to believe that it's all about them and that they don't need to worry about anybody else.
Right.
And they are in an awfully difficult bind. And some of them just try to realize, well, I've only got one life. I die alone. I've just got to navigate what I have. And maybe I have another relationship with other kids or my other children or my relationship with my partner. And it's a really unhappy, sad way forward. But it does feel, sometimes it definitely feels healthy because it's so abusive that they've been through.
No, it's true. And the webinar I just gave this past Tuesday, the topic was, how do I cope with the pain? And this is one of those where I had, over 600 people sign up for it. And that is the issue for so many of these parents, because a lot of them in the short term anyway are not going to be able to reconcile with their child, and for some in the long term. So learning how to cope with that with that reality is critically important to a happy life. And, no child has the right to take away a parent's right to live and to be happy. And mothers in particular struggle with that. A lot of dads kind of will go like, well, screw that kid. I'm not writing them an amends letter. They can write me one. That wasn't my attitude, but a lot of dads that I work with are. But most mothers feel like, well, I'm the mother. I should keep trying. I must have done something wrong. The internalization that so many women feel makes it harder for them.
Do you find a good deal harder on mothers? Because I've unbelievably so.
Well, here's an interesting statistic. There was a recent study out of Ohio State which found that 1 out of 4 dads are currently estranged. 1 out of 4 fathers are estranged. That study found 6% of mothers. Other studies said it's more between 10 and 12%, which seems, I believe it's 12% or even higher. But who shows up to the webinars? It's not dads. I mean, I've got maybe 1 out of 20 dads will be in one of my webinars. And in my survey of 1,600 estranged parents, I don't know, maybe 3% of the ones who responded were dads. So it just shows the cost of motherhood, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah.
For sure. And I also wonder if in addition it shows the compartmentalization that men are so able to do. Because you talk about that too. Like at some point you have to compartmentalize this so that your kid doesn't rob you of your own life and joy too.
Exactly.
I actually have a 2-part question about something that I wanted to touch on, which we've danced around it. There are a lot of kids going online and diagnosing their parents as borderline or narcissists or some kind of abusive parent. And if you look at the checklist and the materials that they're using to define those terms, as you said, with concept creep, there are things that like any other generation of person would say, this is normal, like totally normal childhood stuff.
Yep.
And as we know, this is exactly how a lot of kids diagnose themselves with gender dysphoria, like these very ubiquitous puberty-related discomforts that have something to do with biological sex, but aren't exactly the same thing. Right. So it's like, my mom did make me feel guilty that day when I didn't clean my room. She told me I was a slob. But like, is that the same thing as narcissistic abuse? So I wonder, like, how big of a deal do you think that is? Like, is that playing a big role here?
Yes.
Say more.
Absolutely it is. Okay. Yeah. There's a saying by the Israeli sociologist Eva Illouz that she says, today our lives are plotted backwards. What's a dysfunctional family? It's a family where your needs weren't met. How do you know your needs weren't met? By looking at your present condition. And I think that statement, more than any other, completely speaks to this moment. And that for so many younger generations, they're coming into adulthood thinking, gosh, I have anxiety, I have depression, I have suicidal ideation, I have gender dysphoria. I need to reverse engineer my family and look at my childhood and see where the traumas are. I actually had an adult child ask a parent, well, my therapist asked me to look to ask you where I had been traumatized as a child. So there's a sort of assumption that the trauma defines who we are today. And that if we have problems, in adulthood, then there must be a trauma that underlies it. And sure, that can happen, of course, right? I mean, there are real traumas in childhood that can have long-term implications for somebody's happiness and well-being and psychological functioning. But this idea that every problem that you have in adulthood stems from a parental error is A, wrong, and B, puts so many parents, so many kids on the fast track to cutting off the parent, because it's kind of like, well, you traumatized me, so I owe you nothing. And actually the healthiest thing for me to do is just to cut you out of my life. And that's viewed as some kind of act of assertiveness rather than the kind of conflict avoidance that it is.
And arguably all long-term relationships, they encompass some pain and disappointment and devastation, and betrayal. And there's a kind of a new thinking that the kids think I'm unhappy, therefore, if it's not one thing, it's the mother type thing. Therefore, it's my parent. My unhappiness is because of my parent, missing the massive universal truth that life is difficult.
Exactly.
And it's nothing to do. Parents are as flawed as everybody else. Of course, they were flawed. We're all flawed. You'll be flawed.
Yeah.
But they've missed the truth of life by blaming their parents.
Yeah, they have it. I think this goes to Jonathan Haidt's notion of safetyism, that parents who've been parenting for the past 3 decades or so, 2 to 3 decades, really tried to encase their children in a much more safe environment. They didn't really expose them to the kind of risks that most of us had growing up. And so that leaves these children both less able to cope with the kind of slings and arrows of life, but also with an expectation that life doesn't encompass this. I think to your point, Stella, that suffering is a fundamental part of being human, and it's also a part of every relationship. There's going to be conflict. And that's one of the things that I see with so many adult children who cut off loving, dedicated grandparents because they have beef with their parent. And they say, well, if it's not good for my mental health, it's not good for my kids. It's like, wait a second. You're going to say that you're loving, your parents who are operating as loving grandparents, they've been grandparents to your children for all this time, that's not a trauma to them. And just because you have beef with your parent, that somehow, it's just a conflation of their own psychology with that of their children. So, but it all goes back to this whole safetyism kind of protected environment.
Could I add to that point? I think I'm really glad you raised the grandparents. I had a difficult relationship with my parents, and when I had children, the healing that took place when I saw how much my parents adored my children.
Right.
They annoyed me. I annoyed them still. But the love that they had for my children, I was like nobody else loved them. Me and my husband and my parents loved and adored my children in an indescribable way. Yeah. And it was very, very healing. And I never saw that coming.
And it is kind of indescribable, isn't it? I mean, I have a grandchild, and fortunately, I was reconciled with my daughter before he was born. But it is kind of indescribable, the love that a grandparent has for a grandchild, and the love that they have for the other. And this generation, I mean, not to cap too much on this generation, because there's a lot of strengths and values of this generation. And my children are they're millennials, they're not Gen Z, but millennials are doing it too. That are so preoccupied with their own traumas are not really facing the trauma of their own that they visit on their own children when they cut off a loving grandparent to those children, or the traumas they're causing their own parent when they cut that parent off out of their own lives. But I think your story, Stella, is true of many people where they might have felt like, my parents weren't great parents. In many ways, they were highly problematic, but they're amazing grandparents. And to your point, kind of witnessing that actually allows you to forgive them and see them in a more forgiving, loving light, which is hugely important. Yeah.
I want to touch on something to kind of go back to the question about this diagnosis of the parents. I always try to think about like two sides of a coin, right? So of course there are parents who are unfairly being accused of all these things that are really blown out of proportion, et cetera, et cetera. Right. And then I'm sure that within this population, there are a number of people who come to you that are the narcissists, in fact, and they're having a woe is me moment, and they refuse to hear anything that their child has to say. So I guess, how do you decipher when you're working with a parent or you're consulting with someone, how do you decipher if they are being unfairly accused or if they indeed are somebody with like this really unhealthy personality trait?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, one of the ways that I do it is I always ask to see correspondence between the parent and the adult child, because sometimes the parent will present themselves in a very idealized light. And I'll think, well, what's this kid's problem? And then I'll see the correspondence between them and the child. And I'm like, okay, I see what the problem is. So that will kind of give me a clue about it. But sometimes people present themselves in a way that sort of, it's obvious, even if I don't see the correspondence. And then the issue is, are they going to be, am I going to be able to help them to kind of do the really hard step of accepting responsibility and taking the heat from the child if the child's going to talk to them in family therapy and face them with the ways that they felt like they failed them or hurt them. And I've been surprised in both directions. I've been worked with parents who I thought, they'll really do great in family therapy, and they're incredibly defensive. And others who I thought, I'll do it with you, but I'm going to probably have to sit on you the whole time, and they perform beautifully. So we sort of never know. I mean, as an aside to that, a lot of adult children, because part of my work is I'll reach out to the adult child if they're not reconciled and see if they'll just start by talking to me, and if they'll talk to me, if they'll do a session with the parent. but I'll say to them that, that in going into the therapy, the goal of the therapy is really to help your parent to take more responsibility and do a deeper dive and that kind of thing. So it's interesting and complicated work.
It is.
That's actually very interesting. So you kind of use the same strategies, which I'd love to get into because I realize we're talking around them, but you basically use the same strategies that you advise parents when you reach out to the young adult child, as in like, this is a space for you to be heard.
Exactly.
I'm here to facilitate your parent understanding you better, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think that's really well said, Sasha, that it's that in that session with that adult child, I'm basically listening to them in the same way that I want the parent to. I'm just listening with empathy and understanding and assuming that they've got good reasons for their feelings. I mean, I may be thinking, oh yeah, but you shouldn't cut your parent off for that, but it doesn't matter, right? I mean, I'm there to learn and to empathize and to help them feel like I can be an advocate for them, because my goal and my hope really is that they'll do a session with me. So I tell both the parent and the adult child that this is really about the parent doing a deeper dive into understanding the adult child. And that also allows them to feel safer getting into the ring with the parent, because they're estranged for a reason. I mean, I may not like the reasons, whatever, but they're, from their perspective, it's the healthiest thing for them to do. And speaking of that, when I encourage the parent to reach out, and when I reach out to the adult child, I say that I know that you wouldn't do this unless you felt like it was the healthiest thing for you to do. And I put in the language of health because that's the way this generation talks. And again, I don't mean that in a pejorative way, right? It's good to have healthy relationships.
Totally.
Yeah.
Could I ask you about the letter of amends?
Yeah, sure.
I remember when I was a student studying psychotherapy, and my lecturer, it was a real moment in the class. The lecturer talked about the Hawaiian mantra. I'm going to pronounce this wrong. Ho'oponopono, which is basically, and I went back and I tested it on my partner, and he completely melted. And I thought, well, I never have a little piece of magic in here, where you basically say to anybody, I'm sorry, please forgive me, I love you, and thank you. And you just say, all of you who are listening could just go and say it to anybody. Just say those four and watch them. They don't even ask you what you're sorry for. They just melt and go, thank you. Do you know what I mean? It really is an incredibly powerful thing to say, those four statements. And it reminded me of that with the letter of amends. It's a very powerful strategy. I'd like to hear you.
Except if someone says, well, what are you sorry for? And then you're like, well, I don't know.
Exactly.
I thought I was going to get that. And what I've got time and again is a melting, a kind of a physical kind of, do you know what I mean? The softening can happen. It's going to happen all over the world right now because I've just told everybody. But there's a softening can happen that is extraordinary. Of course, there'll be a few contrarians who say what he says. But in my experience, it's been a very powerful thing. Anyway, I'd love to hear, Joshua, your thoughts around the letter of amends, because I have a few questions. Questions around that letter. Yeah.
Sure. Well, just to edit the Hawaiian saying, I encourage parents not to say, please forgive me, because I don't feel like the parents can ask for anything. I think it just has to be an extension of compassion and empathy and responsibility taking. And I think, so anyway, so to talk about the method. So I always encourage parents to start off the letters saying something like, I'm writing to see if it's possible to open up a dialogue with you. I know you wouldn't have cut off contact unless you felt like it was the healthiest thing for you to do. If they don't know really why the adult child has cut off contact, then I encourage them to say, it's clear that I have significant blind spots as a parent or as a person, that I don't have a better understanding. Perhaps you've told me and I haven't been able to hear it, but I want you to know that I am willing to hear it now. If you feel comfortable writing me or telling me, I promise to listen purely from the perspective of listening and learning and not in any way to defend myself. There are things you'd like me to be working on in my own therapy, or if you were open to do family therapy with me as well, I would welcome that as well. Hope you'll let me know. And I've gotten, again, it isn't like every parent gets a good response. Some parents get no response. Some parents get a response where the kid says, you should know. I'm not going to tell you. I've already, it's not my job to tell you, which is of course absurd. But a lot of them
Emotional labor.
Exactly, a lot of emotional
Yeah.
labor.
Do the work.
Yeah, do the work. Exactly. But a lot of them say that it actually was the line that, I know you wouldn't do this unless you felt like it was the healthiest thing for you to do. If the parent does know, then I encourage them to just, I say you have to have blood on the tracks. You can't say if I did anything wrong or maybe I wasn't perfect or, you have to, the more bluntly and boldly you can state it, the better. In AA, they have the notion of you have to make a fearless searching and moral inventory of your character flaws. And that's part of your recovery, which I think there's so much wisdom in that, what I tell parents is it's not only therapeutic for your potential relationship with your child, it's actually therapeutic for you to be able to just acknowledge it, because what stays in the dark grows in the dark. The more that we as parents white knuckle it and say, well, it wasn't so bad, or, but you're not remembering all the good things that I did, or I was mostly a great parent. Why are you focusing on that? And why are they focusing on that? The more it sort of can grow inside you, the more you can just say, yeah, I could see how you felt really hurt by that. Or that was a big mistake on my part. Or yeah, it is a character flaw of mine. I mean, in my own case, I didn't like writing, I wrote several letters to my daughter like that. It was very, very painful to write, to face the ways that she felt neglected or hurt or displaced when I remarried, or where she didn't get the same kind of attention. I didn't really like having to say all that. But it was also therapeutic for me. And it also, meant something to her that I was able and willing to go that far. So I think those are the main principles, that you find the kernel, if not the bushel of truth in the child's complaints, and go from there.
I think it's very generous. I love the spirit of the letter of amends. I worry that so many parents I've worked with have been abused by their children, and they are beginning an inauthentic, dishonest communication with that.
Yeah.
And also I worry about asking them to send, you've got a certain position of responsibility as a therapist. If I ask them to write it, or I would never ask them obviously to write it, or, but the kind of concept of putting it on the table is presuming the parent is in the wrong, the child is in the right. And, arguably, that's what you do to retrieve in a strange situation, so that you can then begin to build a healthy. I think it's kind of you lose to win or something like that, but it feels really, really difficult for somebody like me who's just so feisty. I can't imagine me having the ability to say it's all my fault.
Well, you're not saying it's all your fault. You're not actually saying I was a bad, neglectful parent or a person. You're just saying I could see how that behavior led you to feel that way. It's like when I do my family therapy sessions, one of the ground rules I have is, you get to say the way that you interpreted your parents or your family members' actions, but only they know what they were thinking or feeling. So you can't say, you wanted to hurt me, you wanted to humiliate me, you wanted to shame me or to reject me. You can say, that's what I interpreted from your behavior, is that you were shaming of me or hurtful or whatever.
But there's no room for you to say, you hurt me.
For the parent, not in the early phase. What I found in doing this kind of work is that first the adult child needs to feel really heard and understood, or they're going to stay estranged. But once they're kind of like, okay, there's some traction here, I feel like my parents really getting it, then there's more room for a real relationship to evolve out of that. And, for the dynamic to be clarified, because often what the child is experiencing as the parent's abuse is really the child not seeing the ways that they evoke the negative behavior from the parent by being rejecting or critical, or to your point, Stella, abusive. So, but I think they're almost always worth starting with, even if the parent does feel abused, because they're diagnostic. Because sometimes a kid can be abusive or seem abusive because they're just desperate and they feel unheard and unseen. And so they're just amplifying their complaints or even exaggerating them as in a way to get on the parent's radar. But if the parent's kind of like going, okay, I get it. For a certain percentage of adult children, they'll calm down and a good dialogue can happen from there. But if it doesn't, if the kid just keeps, I say the kid, but if the adult child just keeps escalating or getting more hostile, then it's kind of like, okay, well, I guess you're really not ready to reconcile. I'm not going to keep throwing good energy after bad. I wouldn't tell the parent to say that, but they are diagnostic in that way.
So you're really just trying to allow the young adult to feel non-defensive, non-confrontation, so they can soften and be in communication and in contact. And I mean, I think when I've thought about your work and kind of watched your videos and interviews, we tend to focus a lot on this first phase because, of course, this is the crisis
Right.
point. Parents are contacting you because they've been cut off or they've gotten some sort of a don't contact me letter or whatever. Yep. Can you talk a little bit about what are subsequent phases? Like once, if a child allows the parent back into their life, what are kind of the next steps, or what is the goal ultimately?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And what I tell parents is, in terms of the amends letter, like, what you were saying earlier, Stella, parents feel like, well, I don't want to have a relationship like that with my kid. I'm going to have to be on my knees forever. And I say, this isn't forever. This is just strategic to see, not manipulatively strategic, but it's just an attempt to get the relationship on a new footing, because once it is on a new footing, then it allows for a different relationship to occur. Now, it may not be the same relationship that you had before. It probably will have to be more in line with the child's ideals and their boundaries, et cetera. But it's not going to be the way it is now, where you just are going to have to, have a relationship where you're just living in a state of apology. But again, we have a saying in couples therapy that couples therapy can only proceed as quickly as the least healthy member. And that's true of families in general, that if the parent's really healthy and the adult child's really not, can only go so fast. And similarly, if the adult child, whichever I started with first, but if both people are reasonably healthy, then enormous progress can be made and deepened. But sometimes parents have to accept that the adult child just can't really have the kind of relationship with them that they wish that they could have or hope that they could have. And if they sort of have to accept, if they want to have a relationship, they have to accept the limitations of what that child's able to offer them.
We offer in the GDSN, the Gender Dysphoria Support Network, it's kind of a parents facilitated meetings. And so it's very like Al-Anon, if you follow me. It's the parents are facilitating other parents. Mm-hmm. And we have, we run about 5 meetings a week, online meetings, but one of them is specific to estranged parents. So it's estranged parents giving support to estranged parents, not necessarily in a bid to retrieve the relationship, more to give support to each other in this difficult space. It's such a heartbreaking place for them to be.
It is. Absolutely. Yeah. It's a really heartbroken population, no question.
We hope you're enjoying this conversation as much as we are. We just wanted to take a quick moment and say thank you to all of our listeners. Your support helps us to keep the lights on and the mics hot.
We recently made the switch to Substack so we could build a more robust listener community. Visit widerlenspod.com and check out the different subscription tiers.
For those of you who are in need of parenting support and resources, we each have parent coaching membership groups. Plus, you can buy our book, When Kids Say They're Trans.
And if you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe and get involved in the lively discourse in the comments section.
Thank you so much. Now, back to the show. Are there particular patterns that you have noticed, like, a lot of kids freshman year of college meet a new girlfriend or boyfriend and go no contact? Or like, are there any particular kind of scenarios that you see popping up over and over? And I wonder if gender has become part of it, because I think I saw a stat somewhere that a certain percentage of people you talk to have kids who are gender questioning. So what are some patterns you're noticing these days?
Well, I'm certainly seeing the gender questioning kids and seeing a lot of, I don't have a huge population in my practice, but I think I told you that I did a retreat for estranged parents recently of 14 estranged parents, and 3 out of the 14 had kids who had estranged over their desire to transition. And in each case, the parents were pretty reasonable parents. These were not transphobic parents. These were parents who were willing to be supportive and to accept the child's perspective and to change pronouns, and the adult child was still not willing to do it. And to me, that just sort of speaks to this sort of identitarian moment that we're in, where rejecting a parent becomes part of the larger identity and the quest for a new identity. And it's not so much about the parent's abuse, and that history can get rewritten, where a good, loving parent is now being transformed into having been a transphobic, abusive parent, and relatively small failures in parenting or get blown up as some enormously powerful failures. So I think that's hugely important. I think bad therapy is a huge problem right now, where so many therapists are, it's kind of like the Eva Illouz quote. They sort of assume that if the adult child's struggling, and it's a particularly problem with Gen Z, that cohort from 1995 to 2012, because they're struggling more than anybody. And so many of them are getting into therapy with a therapist who assume everything comes from a parental trauma, and they're acting like going no contact is some noble, virtuous, assertive thing to do, rather than
Hero's
just being
journey.
conflict avoidant. When the adult child marries, that's often a flashpoint, particularly if the spouses choose them or me. You can't have both. Divorce is an enormous flashpoint, not only because one parent may alienate the child against the other parent, but the child may independently ally with one parent over the other, commonly daughters with mothers, not always, but statistically, commonly daughters with mother. They may not get along with the step parents or step siblings. That's a common pathway. But also, I think, and this goes to our identitarian moment, one of the downsides of this much more intensive psychological, anxious parenting that we've been doing over the past 3 or 4 decades is that for some adult children, they just get too much of us. They just don't know any other way to feel separate from the parent than to cut them off. I've had at least two strange adult daughters say to me, I just don't know any other way to get my mother's voice out of my head than to cut her off. And so for them, the estrangement, they may make it about some terrible thing that the parent did, but you hear what they did and it's not that terrible. So you just sort of assume it's much more of a separation individuation thing.
Myself and Sasha have really worked a lot talking about this. And, in our book, when kids say they're trans, we raise it, this enmeshment, and that the only way the child can actually individuate is they have to kind of silence the parent. They have to get away from the parent, just for even, and for as long as the parent keeps on jumping after them, they're dragging out the process, because actually the child seems to need to stop that. It's shocking how common that is. It's extraordinary.
It is. It's kind of fascinating. And I think one of the problems is cell phones, that when I was growing up, I moved from Dayton, Ohio, where I grew up, to San Francisco in my early, I was 21. And, I wasn't like calling my parents every day from a payphone, or, it took me several weeks to come out here because we camped along the way. And maybe I called them collect when I got here. I certainly didn't send them any photos, but for the average parent, if their kid's traveling across the country, they're expecting to see photos. They're texting them every day. And it's a problem, because for some adult children, they can't kind of grow up organically in the ways that they want to. So I think, to your point, Stella, that for some, estrangement is kind of the only way that they can feel a sense of individuation and separation and feel like they're their own person. The problem is that they often explain it they don't really know that, I don't think, psychologically. So they often explain it to the parent using the language of harm, abuse, trauma, and neglect. And the parent's like, what the hell are you talking about? So then they're off to the races in that way, because then now that's the proof of the abusive parent. So, but
yeah, that's a good point. And I mean, speaking of that individuation piece, I wonder, do parents contact you with like a teenager who's like, let's say, run away and refuses to talk to them? And, I'm thinking a bit about Abigail Schreier's new book, Bad Therapy, which you mentioned a moment ago, but conceptually, bad therapy. And like, I do think that there are probably some situations with a younger teen who's still living at home where the issue isn't so much that the parents have to capitulate to their demands, but like actually the parents need to step into their authority in a loving way, but in a way that is also assertive and kind of taking charge of this poor kid who's like a mess and maybe under the influence of a terrible other friend, or, like a runaway situation. So I guess like that's an interesting, it's not really a clear dividing line, but can you talk about that?
Oh, no, I think there's a huge difference between an estranged adult and a kid who's in the house, who's either acting estranged, as some of these kids do. They just go to their room and they won't talk to their parents, or they're just rebellious or difficult. Because if the child's still living in the home and they're a minor, parents do have a lot of authority, and they shouldn't cede their authority. I mean, they shouldn't cede their authority in the way that they kind of have to once the kid is grown and independent, because the adult child has all the power to determine whether or not that relationship is going to continue. But if the parent's supporting the child and they're living under their roof, they absolutely, I don't encourage them to do all the things that I would tell a parent to do for an adult child. I think to your point, Sasha, it's more important for them to maintain their authority and strength in a loving way. The research is that authoritative parenting is the most effective, where you're both clear about your authority, but you're also loving. That's the best of the various options compared to, say, neglectful parenting or authoritarian parenting. But no, I think that they're very different. Yeah.
There's two things that I'm thinking of, like, as we come towards the end of our conversation, the main bit. One is the concept of filial duty and how that has just seems to have gone. And you spoke a bit about the individualistic culture, and you said America. It's not only, I have to say, I'm in Ireland. It's rampant, but the concept of filial duty really seems to have vanished very fast.
Yeah.
And it was pretty entrenched for thousands of years. And
That's true.
It's extraordinary. And the second thing after that is, just to touch on the mothers again, and we might speak about that in the exclusive content because it's such a big concept.
Sure.
Why the mothers are so badly blamed.
Yeah.
But yeah, filial duty.
And can I just add, like, I don't think this is something I wanted to ask about. This is not happening in certain types of cultures. Right. Like, my family in the Middle East, like, cutting off your parents is completely unheard of. That would never, ever, ever happen. If anything, parents cut off the child if they're sufficiently
exactly. Yeah.
So anyway, so that's a great question, Stella. I'd love to.
Right. No, I think it's an important thing to emphasize, Sasha, that not particularly countries that, we've used more communitarian, say in the Middle East and in Asia in particular, the sense of obligation from the child to the parent is still very, very pronounced. And even in the U.S., I'm seeing more Asian American parents or immigrant parents who are from Asia. I very rarely see. I have a few Middle Eastern over the years of parents in my practice, but I'm seeing more Asian parents, India in particular, and also Southeast Asia. But it's still the minority. It's mostly white families, frankly. And statistically, Black mothers are less likely to be estranged from their children, but Black fathers are even more likely than white fathers to be estranged. So these things can break up. They can kind of get divided culturally within the U.S. as well. But no, I think what we're talking about for Western societies is rising rates of individualism, and individualism is a preoccupation with oneself and one's own happiness, one's growth, one's mental health, and that is happening continuously in Western societies. I think that the United States is probably the worst of the lot, even compared to the UK, but we are seeing it in other countries as well. And I think it's a serious problem. I think a lot is lost in that. And I think a lot of
and it's really interesting to see, like, immigrant families who, like, their kids were raised with the Western values, and then the parents are trying to apply the same pressure and guilting their kids into sticking around. And those are, in my experience, some of the worst cases of estrangement, because the parents don't really understand the concept of taking responsibility, owning your mistakes, apologizing to a child. It's, like, very, very strange. Yeah. So those are some of the worst cases that I've seen.
No, I agree with you. And it's, to me, they're also the most tragic, because some of these parents moved from countries where they suffered enormous privation and they risked everything to come here, and they don't have any family or friends here to support them. And they, sacrifice everything. They get their kids sometimes to, like, an Ivy League school where they're surrounded by these much more identitarian Western values. And now the kids are talking about emotional abuse, and you boundary crossers and narcissism. And the parents are like, I gave you everything. I've given you the life that I wanted to give to myself. And this is how you repay me. So you're right, Sasha, that their response, of course, is just like the worst way that they should respond if reconciliation is their goal. But it's also completely understandable that they would respond in that way. That's like the most tragic in some ways.
And why do you think that the mothers get it in the neck so much more than the fathers? Like, I even see it with my own kids. Like, they give out to me, they ring me up to give out about how Henry has been mean.
Henry had what?
their father has been mean to them. And I'm like, go and tell him. They're giving me an official complaint about him. You know what I mean? Basically, sort him out, mammy. He's been mean.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I think it's so pervasive.
Yeah.
I think it's a real problem. Like in the GDSN, it's 90 to 95% mothers who it's unbelievable, the figures.
Is it the mothers who are estranged or the mothers who reach out for help?
Mothers who are going to online meetings for support because it's so difficult.
Sure. Same for me. Yeah, same for me. It's like, and it's, even though it's a 4-to-1 ratio of fathers to estranged mothers, it's mothers who are reaching out. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, I think that the ideology of motherhood is that you keep trying no matter what, that you're not being a good mother unless you're trying. There's also, I think, the female psychology, which is much more towards internalization, whereas the male psychology is much more towards externalization with blame, aggression, et cetera, even violence, whereas the female psychology is much more towards self-criticism, self-blame, et cetera. I think societally, we're still stuck in the idea that, mothers are more important than fathers. So mothers also identify with that idea. In general, children feel closer to their mothers statistically, and in part it's because mothers do invest more emotional labor into their children. But then, what I've been telling mothers lately is, the same thing that made you a great mother is that part of, being very preoccupied with your child's well-being and thinking about them and doing for them. That's the part of your brain you now have to disable, because that's actually creating your misery. You actually have to stop that part of your brain that's making you feel like you should always be thinking about your child, worrying about them, caring as much about their health. I mean, if they've done everything that I tell them to do and the child's not opening the door, it doesn't help the parent to be completely preoccupied with how the child is doing or feeling like they should be doing or could be doing something else. And the other thing I say to them is that there aren't 100 things you can do to reconcile with your child. You can write a really good amends letter. If you're working with me, I'll reach out to your child. Hopefully they'll do family therapy. But if they're going to keep the door shut, at that point, you don't have 5 other things that you can try. Yeah. So at that point, you have to work on your own serenity and happiness, and in some ways shut down that chamber of your heart with your child's name on it so that your list of your life isn't poisoned by that.
And the rumination, I mean, women tend to ruminate more than men. And I think, like Stella, you could probably relate to this. There are some parents that, regardless of the outside details of their child's life, they are stuck in a pattern of obsessing over their child, obsessing over gender, obsessing over the culture or whatever it is. And that's not healthy at all for the parent. So you talk about like self-compassion for the parent, and we talk a lot about that in our book too. Yeah, rumination is, women are definitely much more vulnerable to rumination than guys are. Guys are, for whatever reason. Well, men just realistically, they're not held to the same standard. I mean, my second book was called The Lazy Husband: How to Get Men to Do More Parenting and Housework, which endeared me to men everywhere. But, one of the things I talked about in the book is that, even if it's a stay-at-home dad, if little Johnny or Janice shows up to school with torn jeans or peanut butter on their face, nobody says, what was his dad thinking? They still think, what was his mother's thinking? Or if the house is a mess and it's dad who's the slob, people don't think, oh, this dad's a slob. They think, oh, this woman doesn't know how to. I mean, those kind of things are still very active in our culture. And so they also impact mothers' ability to kind of detach in ways that is really in their best interest to do. Maybe we'll move into the exclusive listener content in a moment, and maybe we'll discuss how parents and especially mothers can cope better with when they've received an unfair proportion of the blame, and how to kind of live their lives regardless of that, because it's so very difficult. I would like to ask, because I often do these days when I remember, is there anything you're watching or listening or reading that you'd like to recommend? You mean just in general for fun, or things that are influencing me? Oh, well, for fun. Either. I mean, my wife and I just got done watching the Bon Jovi miniseries. Is it good? It's actually really good. I mean, I was not a particular fan, and I'm still not really a fan of the music. But it's a really, it's a really vulnerable story. He kind of loses his voice, and it's sort of an interesting life history and his reflections on getting older. So that was great. Oh, that's a good one. Thank you. I mean, I tend to read a lot of nonfiction. I read a recent history of the Holocaust by Dan Stone called A New History of the Holocaust. I
recently read Jonathan Haidt's new book. I read
Brilliant.
Abigail Schreier's book. So, I recommend all of those. On the novel side, I read Yellowface, which is actually a really good book. I forget the author's name. I think it's Kuang, Kuang. So what else?
That's a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, those are great recommendations.
I mean, the TV recommendation, it's not my favorite thing to even recommend, but I rewatched The Sopranos recently for the third time, so that's
Brilliant.
so good.
I
yeah.
rewatched it recently. Really brilliant.
Yeah,
really
I have to
brilliant.
watch it for the first time. I've never watched Sopranos,
it's a
but I have a
treat.
feeling I'm going to love
It's really,
it.
I mean, if you can get past the violence and the gratuitous sex, the family stories are completely spot on.
Yeah, no,
and
I can get past it.
The acting is amazing. So, no, it's really
Okay,
worth seeing.
That's
yeah.
great. And we also have for you, Joshua, some special kind of listener questions. So for those listening who are still here, if you are part of, our higher membership tiers, you can submit questions for our upcoming guests. So we have a special question for you. So we will wrap up the main portion of our conversation here. And for those of you who are subscribed, we'll see you over in the Substack. Thank you so much. We'll be sure to link your books and your website.
Thank you.
And it was just a pleasure to speak with you.
Pleasure was mine. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
And be sure to visit us on Substack by going to widerlenspod.com. There you can join our listener community, access bonus content and resources, plus learn about additional ways to support the show.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.